Welcome to Friday Live with Byline Times. I am Hardeep Matharu. I'm the editor of Byline Times, and I'm joined by Adam Bienkov, our political editor, and Josiah Mortimer, our chief reporter. Over the next hour, we will be dissecting the developments in the second week of riots, which are sweeping across England. Then we'll be going across the Atlantic and looking at perhaps more positive developments in the US, a right turnaround in a matter of weeks. Adam, do you want to kick off with what are the latest, most pertinent developments in this quite fast-moving story, in some ways, about what is being billed the race riots of 2024?
Yeah, so as you say, we're into the second week of these riots, which in and of itself is notable. I mean, looking back to the 2011 riots, they only lasted, I think, the best part of a week. We're now into the second week. It doesn't seem to be dying down. I think what's different from the 2011 riots is that there seems to be a greater level of coordination. And also, I think social media has played a much bigger role. So people are streaming their activities live on TikTok, particularly, which on the one hand is encouraging a lot more people to get involved. So we're seeing larger numbers getting involved in these riots, but also it's leading to people being much easier to be identified by the police. So we've already seen some seeing some of the first charges coming through of some of the perpetrators of these riots, rapid justice being doled out upon them, which is definitely a positive development. But as I say, it doesn't look like things are dying down particularly. And there have been reports today about some more targeted attacks coming up in the coming days, including against legal professionals, people involved in immigration law, representing immigration cases, particularly worrying in that respect as well. But as I say, we'll have to wait and see how that plays out over the coming days.
It's really striking. I remember it must be just 3 weeks ago, just before, I think Byline Festival had a presence at WOMAD Festival, and the night before we were talking, weren't we, Adam, about the 2011 London riots?
Yes.
And it's exactly what we were saying. We were saying how interesting it was how significant they were and how little they are talked about now, or any sense of learning from what exactly was going on, or any real dissection of it. What do you think is different from what was going on then and what's going on now? Because the riot after the killings in Southport very much started as the reporting around them was that they're riots, these are protesters, and now quite definitively they're being called race riots, the far right extremism. What's sort of the difference, do you think? And is there any relation?
It's an interesting question, because there was, of course, a racial element to the 2011 riots, killing of Mark Duggan. But it was never really talked about in the same way in those terms. I mean, obviously there are big differences, particularly in how this all started. The killings in Southport, the misidentification, the disinformation that was spread, and the fact, I think what happened in the London riots and the other riots that took around the country in 2011, they involved members of the public, but they didn't really have a political edge in the way that these riots do. So the involvement of people like Nigel Farage, his comments that he made in the aftermath of the Southport killings, suggesting that the truth was being withheld from people, playing into conspiracy theories about them being perpetrated by a Muslim individual and this being covered up by the state. That's a real difference. And the involvement of figures like Elon Musk as well, which has taken it to turn it into a global story, and his engagement with Keir Starmer. So it's it's been much more politicized than the 2011 riots, which I think at the time was much more perceived as just a kind of law and order issue. Whereas this is very much about politics. It's about race. We've had this entire debate about two-tier policing, which is now sort of being talked about even in the press as if it's a real thing, when actually all of the evidence shows that if there is two-tier policing, it's in the other direction. People of colour who commit crimes are actually multiple studies have shown are much more likely to be both arrested and to be convicted, to be charged and convicted than white criminals. And so that, I think that is the real big difference, that kind of political edge to these riots that we didn't really see in 2011.
Josiah, do you think it's striking that these riots have come so quickly after the Labour landslide in the general election? I mean, there's been a lot of commentary about the riots. Again, I would question how deep that goes and whether the commentators are talking enough about the political climate and how we reach this point. But some have suggested that actually this is less about race, although it is absolutely the case that some of the rioters will be far-right extremists. And this is much more perhaps a coordinated effort to in some way undermine the Labour leadership and from the beginning put the government on the back foot. I mean, are you struck by how different the tone is just a few weeks on from the election? It's
definitely a change of tone. And I think one thing I've been enjoying doing, maybe enjoying is not the right word, this week is rummaging through lots of Facebook groups from, some organisations that support these riots, but also Reform UK supporters groups. And the themes that come up are pretty common, and there's a lot of repetition, and some of that is blaming the riots on Keir Starmer, saying Keir Starmer should resign over this. So it's gone very quickly to a Keir Starmer must go because of these riots. Others are spreading conspiracy theories, so saying that the riots are apparently being coordinated by 93-year-old George Soros, the US Jewish billionaire. And others that just basically deny that there's a real problem and say that it's actually Muslims who are causing most of the violence. So there's a lot of what you might call sort of far right cope going on, either sort of denying that the riots are really as serious as it appears they are, or suggesting sort of there's underhand things going on. But it does seem to have that political dimension that you're suggesting. I think. Adam touched on the sort of connections with political figures. You've seen people like Tommy Robinson, who have been allowed back on platforms like X, under Elon Musk, and I think that's played into this problem quite a lot. Whereas previously you'd be getting, maybe hundreds of views on a Telegram channel, people like him are now able to get millions of views, and it's being promoted by the X or Twitter algorithm. So I think that's definitely made a difference. They are now emboldened by, some US actors, people like Elon Musk, who are stepping into these domestic debates and Elon Musk, for example, saying that civil war is inevitable in the UK, a country that he has, seems to have no idea about really. Part of me thinks that he's whipping up these claims so that he has an excuse to go to his sort of bunker that he's built on a foreign island, one of these prepper islands that these oligarchs seem to be so fond of. But it's a very strange, very rapidly changing situation. Some people have been calling for, for example, that groups like the English Defence League to be banned. I think that kind of misses the point. Specifically on the EDL, for example, that stopped existing about 10 years ago. Actually, it's now more individual actors who, like Adam says, are individual content creators basically capitalizing at this on platforms like TikTok and Telegram.
And they believe in certain ideas. So a lot of what we're talking about is actually based around this far right idea of the sort of great replacement. And that's what Musk is talking about when he's talking about civil war. That's why there are these attempts to tie Keir Starmer and a new Labour government to this, because this idea that the left is trying to replace the white population, and this is leading to crimes and to attacks on white people. And that's why there's an attempt to misidentify the killings in Southport. And we saw it into the run-up to the election. We reported on some of the sort of racist memes that were pushed out by GB News presenter Darren Grimes, using artificial intelligence generated images to paint Keir Starmer surrounded by Muslims, wearing a burqa himself. And so this idea of trying to tie the Labour Party and the broader global left to Muslims, to an attempt to replace white people with Muslim people and brown people. And so that's kind of the idea that a lot of this is based on, as Josiah says, not necessarily around individual groups like the EDL, but this kind of sort of global sort of far right ideas that we're seeing sort of played out on social media and also now on the streets.
And then all the conspiracy theorist elements all tie into it as well. And so a lot of people who may not be writing but are on social media and seeing these messages being put out, potentially many more people getting drawn in. But I mean, I want to talk a little bit about how it's being reported on and what the balance is to be struck. Because, you know, on one hand, we know that stories become stories and lead the agenda of what is current affairs in this country based on the prominence that they are given. So while this does seem to be, you know, a very important development, I mean, people are out on the streets, there's violence, hundreds of arrests have been made, it is still a minority of people. It is still a minority of people. Social media seems to be playing a huge role in it. It does not seem to be the case that, you know, in real life, people are holding meetings in town halls all across the country right now who have concerns about the Great Replacement theory. So I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we look at this balance that the media has to strike? And I guess I mean, you know, broadcasters with responsibility such as the BBC, there's other standards we sort of expect of the right-leaning tabloid press. But is there an extent to which two things at once are true, that it's both the case that this is a really concerning development and it sort of brings to light all sorts of things, structural underlying issues that we've been talking about for years on Byline Times, but also that this is a minority of people and there isn't a civil war, and it's important. And we've just had a Labour landslide being elected in this country,
you're absolutely right. It is a minority of people, and there has been some sort of quite extensive polling out in the last week showing quite how much of a minority that worldview is, and there is very little sympathy for the kind of position that Nigel Farage has been putting out about this, about two-tier policing and the riots, and so it is definitely a minority issue. However, I think it's understandable the scale of the coverage, the fact that we are seeing hotels being burnt down with racial epithets sort of daubed on the walls, bricks thrown at mosques. I think the broader question is what role the media has had in getting us to this point, and the kind of the two-tier approach that has been taken to the extremism on the right as opposed to extremism elsewhere. I mean, if you just look at what Nigel Farage has done, if you can kind of sort of a thought experiment, imagine there was a British Muslim politician who had their own TV station and was putting out conspiracy theories about white Christians, for instance, and then this led to riots. I mean, we wouldn't see that there would be call for that individual to be arrested. There would be calls for the organisation they represented to be proscribed. But instead, we have Nigel Farage on the front cover of the Daily Express today, issuing a warning to the government saying, essentially, do as I say, otherwise we're going to see more violence on the streets. And this is part of a sort of long sort of mainstreaming of these kind of extreme right views, personified by Nigel Farage himself, that has never really been challenged. And there has been this kind of two-tier approach to where certain forms of extremism, I think, have been, particularly on the right, have been tolerated in the UK for far too long. And we're seeing the result of that on the streets.
It's interesting because I wrote an editorial for Byline Times, I think just 4 days before the election, when the Channel 4 investigation came out about the Reform Party activists, and one of whom was filmed calling Rishi Sunak the P word. And I warned in that editorial, like you're saying, Adam, that Farage isn't good copy. He's not the man down the pub with a few colourful quotes for the media. This is terrifying for people of colour, but I'm sure many people, that, these sort of activists are saying these things about who's then the Prime Minister. And that actually the media needs to wake up, because this sort of, the path where this goes is potentially quite dangerous.
I mean, it's easy, and it's easy to focus on Farage, and we've talked about him a lot so far, and even sort of Tommy Robinson. But really, these are kind of fringe figures. I think we need to look a bit sort of closer to the centre of power. We've had quite recently a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, who previously compared women, Muslim women, to wearing burqas to letterboxes, who said that Islamophobia was a natural reaction to the religion of Islam, who has called Black Africans pickaninnies. And again, this has been not only has this been tolerated, I think in some respects it's been celebrated. He was allowed to get right to the highest position in power. We have, and there's a lot of talk about social media, about the role of social media in these riots. There's been a long history of incredibly inflammatory front pages on the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and elsewhere about British Muslims, about people of colour, about immigrants, about asylum seekers. And that has undoubtedly played a massive role, arguably a much bigger role in the position we're now finding ourselves in than a handful of people sending out a handful of tweets with very few followers.
And even after the riots have begun, you have front pages like from the Telegraph saying, far right and Muslims clash, as if this was sort of, some battle of equals, as opposed to mosques literally being attacked in broad daylight. It suggests that there's an equivalence there between the far right sort of targeting Muslim communities. And I think we should be honest about the fact that almost all of this is aimed at Muslims, really, and obviously that affects brown people and of many religions as well. They're not necessarily particularly intelligent in their targeting, but I think these are Islamophobic riots, and the fact that they've tried to suggest that the Southport killer, was a Muslim who was an asylum seeker without any basis in fact, and then gone on to target mosques. It's almost like they were looking for an excuse.
Yeah, it wasn't an accident. It was by design. Yeah,
exactly. But many of the adverts for these protests have slogans like "Stop the boats" on there, which is obviously a slogan of the last government. And when a government has as its mission "Stop the boats,"
and talks about invasion on our southern coast and all of this kind of language.
Talks about invasion, and then I think, and then fails to solve that problem that it's then whipped up and that right-wing media allies have whipped up. Then, is it any wonder that we see these disgusting sites, which are completely unjustifiable? But then you have the sort of cheek of right-wing outlets to say this is all on the social media firms. As Adam said, they have a role to play in this as well.
And what do we have senior Conservative politicians emphasising this week? We have Robert Jenrick, who is one of the favourites for the new Conservative leadership. His call is for people who shout Allahu Akbar in the street to be immediately arrested, even though it literally just means God is great. But the emphasis is again, is as you say, it's trying to draw that false equivalence between the people that are being attacked and the people who are attacking them.
I think what's really striking is it seems as if this could potentially be a moment. I mean, there's a lot of commentators on social media sharing images of all these front pages and saying, I wonder how we got here, looking at that wider question about the political climate. But for me, the real problem is those voices weren't prominent enough or widespread enough when the political climate was being toxified, right? It's sort of now, as the hotels are burning, after the event, people are saying, oh, God, that was really everything since the Brexit referendum, if not before, that has all led us here, and it seems a little bit too little, too late, to be honest. But, I mean, we also had Suella Braverman, Home Secretary, who was advancing theories about Muslim grooming gangs and how most on-street child sexual abuse in this country is perpetrated by that demographic of people. Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister when he did not condemn as Islamophobic Lee Anderson's comments, suggesting that the Muslim Labour Mayor of London was handing the city to Islamists. Then there are a few policy sort of developments as well. I mean, we had the review into the Prevent strategy, which is a controversial counterterrorism program as it is, not sort of trusted by people in the Muslim community, which suggested that the far-right extremism needed to be second in priority.
Yeah, it's just there was too much
Islamic
focus on it, and it was led by a man, William Shawcross, who himself had made controversial comments about Muslims. It was a highly controversial appointment as well. I think it's a really interesting point you make, Hardeep. I think the kind of optimistic reading of what happens next is that this kind of delegitimizes what we're seeing at the moment, delegitimizes Islamophobic rhetoric and all of that kind of stuff about invasions, about asylum seekers. I'm slightly sceptical that that's actually what we're going to see, because as we saw from 2011, memories can be very short. Once there's been some convictions, once the bad apples have been sort of booted off, then the kind of the sort of broader causes of how we got here, I think, will be quickly forgotten by people who themselves have had a role in getting us into this position.
I was just saying, I think we need a sort of we need an integration strategy for the right wing of this country, the far right. But I was just going to say as well. I mean, one of the things, looking at some of the coverage, particularly channels like GB News and Talk TV in the past couple of weeks. Often they've seemed far more angered at these rioters being called far right, or their supporters being called far right, than they have at the actual violence being unleashed on our streets. I mean, I was trawling through some GB News stuff today, and there are dozens of articles on their website slamming, people being called far right over these riots. And I think it probably pales in comparison to I think condemnation of the riots probably pales in comparison.
And actually, beyond that, they're actually blaming. If you watch GB News, one of the sort of main arguments is that the reason we're having these riots, the reason these riots have gone on so long, is because Keir Starmer has labelled them far right. This is a backlash against the comments made by which, actually misrepresenting what Keir Starmer said. I mean, there was a segment on GB News earlier this week in which they were complaining that the government no longer speaks to them, and in the same sentence they were saying, "Oh, but Keir Starmer in his statement said that anyone who's concerned about immigration is far right." Well, Keir Starmer never said that. So they are spreading this misinformation and trying to put the blame on the people who've literally just come into government, and actually sort of trying to clear up the mess that has been left by the previous government. Because this is one of the worst inheritances that the government has taken on from their predecessors, along with everything else that's
and it
going
is really striking, as you say, Adam, that in terms of senior Conservative politicians, I think 121 Tory MPs remain in Parliament. There hasn't been any sort of very strong, unequivocal condemnation of these riots as Islamophobic riots. I mean, Priti Patel, who's one of the leadership contenders, put out a statement condemning all the violence and, quite strong in that sense, but didn't mention the Muslim communities being targeted. They've all been quite quiet about this. And I guess the fear is that whichever candidate wins, they'll probably stand on a ticket of, for example, we should leave the European Convention on Human Rights and the rulings of its court. To what extent are they not calling this out? Because they will rely on some of this to run their sort of leadership campaigns. I mean, because we can't forget that the candidates are whittled down by the parliamentary MPs, but then, of course, we come back to this problem, I would say, of the Conservative membership in the country then decides on who the leader becomes. And so you're talking about sort of 175,000 people who are much more to the right of the country, even more so since the Boris Johnson era, who then Robert Jenrick or Priti Patel or whoever it is will feel they need to appeal to, with, I fear, some of this more conspiracist, sort of quite extreme views.
And I do think there is a massive problem of Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. I mean, there's been extensive polling of Conservative Party members showing that a majority of Conservative members have quite extreme views about Islam and about British Muslims. This is the membership. And I've been at Conservative Party conference where they have held a panel which is essentially arguing against the existence of Islamophobia, not even debating how we should tackle it or how significant that issue, but saying that the word Islamophobia should not exist as a term. But there has been no serious investigation of Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. It has been downplayed. People who have raised it, like Saeed Avazi, have been massively sort of pushed to the margins of the party. And I think unless they get to grips with that, we're only going to see these problems increase. There's a reason why Robert Jenrick is making the comments he is making about arresting Muslims for shouting Allahu Akbar or for saying Allahu Akbar. But yeah, it does have implications for the next Conservative leadership. You mentioned Priti Patel. She did put out that statement, and she did criticise Nigel Farage for his comments about two-tier policing. Not particularly strong criticism, but she did criticise him. But of course, this is the same Priti Patel who was filmed doing karaoke with Nigel Farage at last year's Conservative Party conference, and has described him as a friend. And he was the sort of guest of honour, Nigel Farage, at the last Conservative Party conference. So this is a really deep problem in the Conservative Party that I think they're not even really identifying, let alone starting to tackle.
Josiah, it's interesting the approach that the government has taken, because Keir Starmer has been very, very clear in saying that these people are thugs, they're right-wing extremists, far right. But the word Islamophobia hasn't readily been used. I mean, do you think that is, a calculated strategy in some way, that it would, does Starmer bank on the fact that that would make it worse somehow to say that this is about Muslims, and that would exacerbate the notion that the Muslim community are problematic in some people's eyes? Or do you actually think he doesn't want to mention it because he's also playing to a base of people that perhaps switched from Conservative back to Labour just a few weeks ago, and now has to manage that within, how he approaches the riots?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of ways of looking at it. I think one is maybe the reluctance to use what on the right is a contested term, as Adam said. There is just a belief in some quarters that Islamophobia, it doesn't exist. It's instead, there are things like it should be called anti-Muslim hatred, for example. And I think maybe some of that has seeped into Labour Party thinking. I mean, one of Keir Starmer's recent tweets, he said attacks on Muslim communities are he's named that as an issue.
He has specifically identified Muslims as the kind of key victims of all of this, I think.
So I don't know. I think maybe there are just debates over terminology on the Labour side at the moment that they don't want to get bogged down in. Actually on that recent video from Keir Starmer, which did mention specifically anti-Muslim hate, that was then met with a response from Elon Musk saying, why don't you care about all communities being targeted? And of course, then you go down this, a mirror image basically of the Black Lives Matter debate a few years ago, which is, all lives matter, which, completely papering over the fact that some communities in this country are, deliberately stigmatized, do face worse oppression than others. So, I think it's a bit of a quagmire, basically.
But of course, Keir Starmer has got problems with his previous comments, about Gaza and comments he's made about Bangladeshis as well, and during the election campaign. But I think...
And the Ford report
identified
as well,
hierarchies of racism within so he does have issues within the Labour Party that he needs to resolve as well, even if I don't think it's anything like on the same scale as we see in the Conservative Party.
I thought there's quite an uncomfortable moment in recent days in terms of the media coverage of this, when we had Good Morning Britain, which is presented by Ed Balls, so a former Labour MP, former
Shadow
Chancellor, and obviously the husband of Yvette Cooper, the current Home Secretary, who appeared on the show, and he was interviewing her alongside Kate Garraway, which seemed absurd. I mean, it really
it's ludicrous. I mean, I think it was questionable enough him having that role when Labour were in opposition. I think now they're in government, for him to be sort of holding the government to account, particularly his own wife to account, I mean, it's just ludicrous. I think if you call it out on GB News for hiring Conservative politicians, you have to do exactly the same with us.
And so that was one point. But the Labour MP, Zara Sultana, was a guest that morning, and she was talking about this very point that we need to be using. She's a backbench Labour MP, very much seen on the Corbynite left wing of the party, and she was making the point, I think really forcefully through her experience as a Muslim woman of colour, saying, it's really important the language we use around this and to call it what it is. And Kate Garraway kept pushing her, like, why? Why do you want it to be called Islamophobic and the Muslim communities are being targeted? And she was trying to answer the question, saying language is very important because we need to know what's happening to these communities in particular. And then essentially she got into a discussion, which I think is the fault of Ed Balls, really, who was meant to be a presenter, an impartial presenter on this, and then immediately started a conversation with her about immigration generally and the Labour Party's approach to it. And the MP then pointed out, well, he had written a Guardian article on this previously, and Ed Balls said, well, I was completely right in that, because if you have mass immigration, you don't acknowledge people's legitimate concerns, this is what happens. And of course, Sara Sultana was making a different argument, which was, well, those legitimate concerns are not actually legitimate because the problems in people's lives are not caused by immigrants. I guess the reason I mentioned this was, one, I felt it's pretty appalling to see, because it wasn't just Ed Balls and Kate Garraway. There were two other guests as well, Ben Bradshaw and Andrew Pearce of the Daily Mail, they were all sneering and talking over her. And I thought it was pretty appalling. The rest of the panel was sort of white journalists. She was the only one with any lived experience. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what I do think can become a difficult conversation at times around legitimate concerns, which in itself has now turned into quite a loaded phrase. But I guess what I mean by that is there are a few, let's unpick a few of the different things going on. I mean, some of the people who are involved in these riots will have been driven by the Great Replacement theory. There'll be extremist, far-right extremists. There may be other people in watching on in the country who are not on the streets or just sitting at home or whatever, who would never do that, but might in their own heads think, well, there is an issue. There are issues with immigration. We do need to do something about it. I guess what I'm trying to explore is, how do we open up the conversation in a way that is genuinely constructive? Because it feels like anytime, those on the hard right say, well, these people, you can't just label them far right and racist. They have concerns, legitimate concerns. And then potentially you get the far left who say, well, saying they have legitimate concerns in itself is just racist, because they cannot have legitimate concerns. They're just racist. How do we start to look at that, which is really complex? Because I guess my starting point, arguably, would be, as I've discussed with you both before, difference in coexistence is always difficult. It's always difficult. That's not to say we shouldn't be condemning and bringing to justice the people who are on the streets doing what they're doing, which is never, ever acceptable. But I fear that these moments sometimes elevate the kind of black and white approach and the sort of hard and fast approach that's taken to these issues as a whole. Because actually, what we should be talking about, I think, is multicultural Britain is on the whole a success, not because the majority of people are not racist in any way, but because despite difference being a difficult thing in human coexistence, we still have, on the whole, a great society that's harmonious.
Yes, no, I think that's all excellent. I think sometimes the difficulty with talking about these things is that talking about legitimate concerns is just a way to not talk about what's actually happening on the streets. So you see that with Nigel Farage, when he's interviewed about this. He doesn't want to talk about the fact that people who share his essential politics and are followers and fans of his are going out on the street and throwing bricks at mosques. So what does he talk about? He talks about people's legitimate concerns and about how the left and Labour Party are ignoring those legitimate concerns. So I think all of these are really important questions, and I don't think that we should we should ignore the causes of why people feel disenfranchised and why they're in a position where they are going out and doing things that perhaps they don't even really agree with or don't understand, but they're following. I think these are all. I think we have to divorce that from this moment where we have actual racist riots taking place on the streets, and that needs to be dealt with and give no ground to saying that this is acceptable in any way. These people need to be stopped, regardless of whether they're somebody who understands the Great Replacement theory or not. If they're joining in on it, they need to be clamped down. They need to go to prison. And we need to be a zero tolerance approach, because we can't have this taking place on our streets. Then once that's over, once the riots have stopped, then we can talk about all of these other issues. But I really do think we have to kind of keep a kind of strict line between them.
Yeah, you're right, because they do just become conflated. And then I guess what I'm trying to say is these moments then heighten how black and white the whole conversation becomes. And all of these terms, which are very loaded and weaponized and politicized, are then thrown into the pot. And I'm not sure how much that helps anything.
Yeah, and I think particularly with things like riots, which are, they are by definition like very extreme social moments that only involve, a minority of a minority. Sometimes it's easy to forget that what actually drives some of the people to do what they're doing. And I think actually there is a big element of opportunism with these riots. You see people going to them, and actually we've already had some convictions of people who are going to these riots, and then they're also being charged and convicted with drug offences because they're taking baggies of cocaine with them and they're drinking tinnies on the journey, and they're basically seeing this as a day out to cause disruption. So I think there is an element of opportunism as well, and I think it is important not to lump everyone who holds views that are that are anti-immigration with what is as I say, a minority of a minority. Saying that I do agree with Adam that this idea of it's very easy, and it makes a lot of sense for Nigel Farage to talk about so-called legitimate concerns when it helps him avoid the real issue of what's happening right now.
Again, I think you have to flip on it ahead. If there were thousands of British Muslims going out into the streets, throwing bricks at churches, going to tower blocks filled with white Christian people and trying to burn them down, nobody would be talking about legitimate concerns. That just would not be a conversation that anybody would be having. And I think the fact that we are having that conversation in any way at the moment shows how there actually is this two-tier approach to these different forms of extremism.
When we went into the general election campaign, obviously Labour had to set out its stall in terms of issues such as immigration, because that's the issue that sits at the heart of this, that is then weaponized and politicized, and the great replacement theory comes out of that, and this notion of a civil war evolves from it. How likely is it that Labour is going to be able to have, as you say, once the riots have stopped, a perhaps deeper and more constructive and much more urgent conversation that is necessary about all of these issues we're talking about, given that the party did seem to, in its manifesto and its whole approach before the election, seem to acknowledge that they would also try to be quite tough on immigration. Obviously, they scrapped the Rwanda scheme, but that's not to say that they're willing to have a different type of conversation about this issue. Yeah,
it's going to be a really interesting one to watch. I mean, like you say, I think Labour tried to take what is seen as like a blue Labour approach to this, just sort of being tough on immigration but fair. We've heard a lot over the general election campaign of taking on the criminal gangs, people traffickers. What happens if none of that actually makes a difference? What happens if we still see similar amounts of small boats coming over? What happens if overall immigration numbers don't massively change? Is the Labour Party going to be forced into taking or is the Labour Party going to allow itself to take a approach which is closer to what the previous government did? I mean, we've already heard suggestions of offshore processing from the Labour Party. Have to distinguish that from the Rwanda scheme. This is it's not about sending people away to other countries. It's about processing people before they come to the UK. But these kinds of debates, I think there's the question to be asked about to what extent what we're seeing over these few weeks will shape that debate, and whether it will actually make it harder or easier for the Labour Party and for Keir Starmer to have to kind of examine these questions, or whether it's just heightens the emotion of these issues. I mean, there's been some polling out this week showing that concern about immigration now is at the highest level that it's been since 2016, since the Brexit referendum, because these kinds of events do really raise the salience of an issue which previously had been going down quite significantly in people's concerns.
But how striking is that? Because the general election was only on July the 4th, and it did feel like a very different tone. I mean, we all felt that it wasn't a surprise, the election result, and the response was somewhat muted, but there was a sense that, I don't know, the country felt like, wow, we've really, really had enough of this chaos. We need to now go with something a bit more sensible. But how quickly has, as you say, this issue of immigration, for example, been amped up again? And we know from what we've just seen over 10 years that, the media, the politicians, there is a sense that they create the agenda, which then has an impact on the politics. And I mean, on 4th of July, it seemed... On the 5th of July, it seemed a long way until the next election, and these worries that if Labour doesn't deliver, that the far right is waiting in the wings. But
it wasn't waiting in the wings. It was
already
on the stage.
It's already on the stage, and I guess the speed with which we have that has been exposed is concerning.
But I think the upside is that things can change equally as fast as the other way. I think we may well end up in a situation in a few weeks where it's not really been talked about, and that has downsides as well in terms of not addressing real fundamental issues. But I think nothing makes a front page like fire and disorder, and that's what we've seen in spades over the past week or so. As soon as that stops, I'm sure the media will move on to something else. But let's wait and see.
And I do wonder how much of what we've seen is kind of a backlash against the movement in the country, the border movement in the country, which is towards electing a centre-left government, to rejecting the politics of conservatism. And for all the talk of the rise of reform, they only got a very small percentage of the votes and a very small number of constituencies. And I do wonder whether what we're seeing on the street is this kind of almost a deliberate reaction against that sort of border movement in the opposite direction.
Josiah, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the social media platforms, particularly X, formerly known as Twitter, who Adam has rightly pointed out. Elon Musk is the chief, and he is now perhaps overstepping the mark. This is no longer a town square for people to air their views and all be heard. He is the sheriff in town, and he is directly replying to the Prime Minister, for example, and saying that there is civil disorder, civil war coming to Britain. I mean, there was an act that was a piece of legislation that was passed by the last Conservative government, which was supposedly to tackle online harms, the Online Safety Act. Is that in any way useful when it comes to some of the things that people are now saying needs to happen in light of what we've seen play out in recent weeks? So this notion that the Southport killing, it was disinformation on social media that spread like wildfire, that the suspect was a Muslim person.
Yeah, I mean, large parts of the online safety bill when it was going through that were looking at, clamping down on things like harmful misinformation, fake news. They were taken out by the Conservatives in the end on supposed grounds that it would undermine free speech. And I think maybe we're seeing some of the results of that now. I mean, there are parts of the Online Safety Act which I think could make a difference, but much of it hasn't actually come into force yet. It relies on Ofcom, the media regulator, introducing basically add-on regulations and basically getting to grips with matching up with the might of the social media giants effectively. But it will have power to levy quite large fines when that is in place. I mean, in some ways, it's hard to think of a worse boss at this time for the head of one of the biggest online public squares than Elon Musk. I mean, he's broken the convention of social media bosses in endorsing quite an extreme political candidate, Donald Trump, in the United States. Completely gutted the staffing of X's moderation teams. I mean, I put out just a request in the past couple of days saying, has anyone actually seen any posts been removed for hate speech in recent weeks? And almost the unanimous reply was that no, people are reporting quite extreme content and it's not being taken down. But then you had an account which was called White Dudes for Harris, backing Kamala Harris in the US, that was taken down on the grounds that it was a racist hate group. So you see very political decisions like this being made by someone who is in effect a far right, fundamentalist, effectively, in Elon Musk. His views have moved significantly to the extremes in recent years, and he is putting that to, I think, quite damaging use as head of X. And
it is leading to this debate about whether news organisations should still be on Twitter. There was sort of an interesting video by Lewis Goodall of the Newsagents podcast, saying if X, as it's now known, was created today and had been around for a little while and was acting in the way that it is with an owner such as Musk, would news organisations touch it with a barge pole? And I think the answer is probably not. Difficulty is that it is the number one platform for online news, online news in social media in the world. And so news organisations are in a very difficult position. Do you abandon that town square and let it be completely dominated by the hard and the far right? Or do you actually engage with it and get your own messages across there? I think it's a really interesting question, but I think it's a difficult one and I think we're already starting to see people sort of move away from it. But I think it's not a clear-cut answer to that question, really.
We've been talking and reporting on Byline Times for a number of years now, as have other publications, to be fair, about big tech and the implications for democracy. I mean, to what extent is this just inevitable, or do you both feel that this is now going in a direction that is more concerning than even we would have predicted? I mean, there was a lot of talk ahead of the general election about deep fakes and the role they could play in the campaign. It seemed to me, that actually that wasn't as prominent as a feature of what happened as we thought it might be. But the general concept of misinformation, disinformation, really was. I mean, that wasn't necessarily just online. We saw a lot of these questionable leaflets just saying completely misleading statements put out by the Conservatives that were around. And obviously there was a lot of social media is largely unregulated, so you can just say what you want. I mean, do you think this is now moving in a direction which is becoming increasingly a more overt, serious threat to democracy, which goes beyond just deep fakes, and that something deeper is perhaps going on?
I think that places like Europe, the US, I would hope the UK as well, are increasingly alert to the fact that algorithms have such enormous sway over people's experiences online, which, let's face it, is taking up a growing proportion of our lives. I think the EU is probably leading the way ahead of the UK on this after Brexit. But I do get the sense that the action will start to be taken on this, and there will be a bit of a reckoning. The power of tech giants and individual billionaires like Elon Musk and even Mark Zuckerberg at Meta. In the US, we're seeing big so-called antitrust cases being brought against some of these tech giants. Basically saying that they are operating as monopolies. There are moves to breaking up some of these, and I think what happens in the US with these mega court cases actually being pushed by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and I'm sure she will continue some of this if she's elected in November. Could shift the dial a little bit on this.
I mean, there's also a kind of market imperative here. The reason we're talking about X so much is because most of the other big social media platforms have moved away from politics and from news. They're really dialing it down in their algorithms. You don't see anywhere near as much of it on Facebook and other platforms as used to in the past. It's only because Musk is such a politically driven individual that he almost doesn't care that he's losing lots of money on advertising.
And why have the other organisations dialed it down? I mean, has there been some impact of Facebook and the sort of investigations around it in the US?
Yes, partly those investigations, but mostly I think because advertisers don't want their products next to any of this kind of content. That most social media platforms don't want to be advertising next to people putting extreme anti-Muslim content or racist content. It's bad for business, and it's bad for Facebook's business. So that's why they've moved away from it. But of course, Musk is a very different individual, and this seems to be more of a political enterprise than it certainly seems to be much more of a political enterprise than an economic one, because he seems to have lost a huge amounts of money he bought it a massively over rated price, and he seems to have lost a huge amount since then. But the question then is, what do what do you do about that? And I think, Josiah's talked about fines. The EU is going to have some powers in that regard as well. But I think that it is going to come down potentially to sort of greater coordination between different countries and different regions, the EU. It'd be interesting to see what happens post-election. If Harris wins, would a Harris government want to take on this as an issue? We've seen them acting against TikTok in the US. Would they take a similar approach to Twitter or X in the future as well?
And just lastly, before we move across to the Atlantic, what have we seen in terms of the sort of policy, if you like, response to the riots? I mean, obviously, on one hand, hundreds of arrests have been made, and those people now being processed through the courts. In terms of the government's actions or announced actions, I mean, obviously the riots are still happening, so perhaps it will wait until that has ceased in order to announce some policies. But has anything concrete emerged as to what will be done about this?
I think there's been very little, actually, in terms of changes in policy. I think Keir Starmer's general approach, and not just on this issue but on other issues, is to not want to pass too much legislation. So he said that he believes the government or the police already have the powers that they need to tackle this problem. It's just a case of the will and the resources to get it done. So I wouldn't expect too much in the way of sort of emergency legislation. I think had this happened under the previous government, we'd have seen a whole new wave of legislation, as we saw during the anti-protest laws that were forced through and all the rest of it. I mean, maybe that will change post-riots, and maybe we will see something. But I think at the moment, the government's line is that this isn't about changing the law. This is just about cracking down on violent thugs on the streets and getting them through the courts. And
I think that makes sense, to be honest. I mean, it felt like almost a knee-jerk reaction. Anytime there was any kind of protest or disorder under the last government, they'd say, right, we need a new law then. And they'd sort of try and fill in the gaps of what apparently they didn't do in the last piece of anti-protest legislation. So I think it's a good instinct. We have a plethora of laws on the statute book that can deal with violent disorder. I think it's interesting to see the debate shifting to some of this far-right violence being treated as terrorism, which I think would be, I think would be quite fitting, be quite just desserts, considering, that many of these far-right activists think that terrorism is only something that can be committed by those with brown skin. But if it's political violence that's intended to frighten, to scare, to intimidate, and to change politics through violence, then I think that's absolutely legitimate.
And I think we will see some cases charged under terrorism. I think there's already some indication that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw one tweet, I think about a week ago, of somebody saying, just a reminder, as all of this is happening and people are going to now be arrested and potentially be sentenced to prison time, that we currently have Just Stop Oil protesters who were sentenced to prison. I mean, we certainly saw that in the last government, didn't we? This this attempt to prioritize and put more attention on environmental groups, people, doing protests in support of what's the Palestinians, for example. And we even had recommendations from Lord Walney, who was the domestic extremism is the domestic extremism advisor to the government. He published a report which didn't really focus on far right or right wing extremism, but again looked at those particular groups and said that they were the problem. They were conducting domestic terrorism,
which puts a lie to this idea of a two-tier criminal justice system. The fact that we've got Just Stop Oil protesters going to prison for many years on the back of having a Zoom meeting. This is not a system that is stacked in the favour of people on the left at all. There's no evidence of that.
So we should go across the Atlantic. I think we touched on it. Josiah, what do you think? You and I were sitting here, weren't we, in a podcast with Peter Jukes maybe 3 weeks ago, and I was extremely pessimistic and said, well, it's another Trump presidency coming down the tracks. I remember you said, well, things can change very quickly, but are things going to change? How do you feel now about the situation? We have Kamala Harris, who is the Democratic nominee, and she has just announced Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, as her running mate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a remarkable change for the Democrats in a very short space of time. I think it's just over 2 weeks since Biden announced he was stepping aside.
Just 2 weeks.
It feels like a lifetime, obviously. But here we are, and you know, Harris does seem to be climbing in the polls. I think Trump and his vice president pick JD Vance couldn't really have had a worse couple of weeks, and almost every attack that they try and land on Harris and no doubt now Waltz just seems to be falling flat. I mean, Donald Trump has been going from calling her laughing Kamala to lying Kamala, even deliberately mispronouncing her name, or actually adding a B, Kamabla. He's been calling her in tweets recently, just as it's complete word garbage, basically. So I think that's really falling flat, and you know, it's striking just how organised the Harris campaign has been. They've moved incredibly quickly to get a vice president pick. You know, getting that done and dusted in basically 2 weeks, and they picked someone who I really think is probably the unity figure for vice president. I think if Tim Walz hadn't have made comments about you know, Republicans being weird, which is what sort of catapulted him to prominence in the Democratic Party over the past couple of weeks, then maybe we wouldn't be here. But I think he does seem like a very strong pick. He can, and I think probably will speak to a different group of Americans, or a wider range of Americans, those sort of you know, white male and many Midwestern voters that it's seen that Kamala Harris can't reach quite as easily. So it's a balanced ticket, I think you call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we did this podcast, I think, on the day that Biden stood down, and we were discussing this. And I think at the time I said it looked like things were slipping away from Biden. I think some of the polls had Trump ahead by sort of 4 or 5 points. And I said that I believed it was going to be a close race with Harris, but that she had a fighting chance. I think I've sort of gone further now. I actually think she's close to being the favourite to winning now. She's ahead in the national polling by a couple of points on average. And she's starting to sort of nudge back in the sort of close state races as well. As Josiah says, I think Trump and JD Vance seem to be don't know how to deal with her. They're really struggling. The Harris Waltz campaign now, it seems to be incredibly well organised. The messaging they're putting out is really finely tuned. This weird attack, I think, is very effective. It's effective. There's a lot more enthusiasm, which I think we discussed at the time for Harris. And Trump's act just looks incredibly tired and old. The kind of joker's got old.
And I guess he has been doing it, peddling it for a long time now, comparatively, hasn't he?
Since 2016, and the electorate has changed. The US electorate has changed since 2016. So I think it will be a close race still, and you know, I think the odds have it pretty much 50-50 at the moment. But I do think as we get closer towards the election, that those kind of advantages that Harris has will start to show. The only sort of proviso I'd say to that is there are some suggestions that the US economy might be about to turn. So there are some fears that we could start to see some bad numbers in the US economy, and that could have an impact. We've seen that. Seen what's happened in our election, where the economy has not been in a great state, how much of a swing there was against the incumbent. So if that trend does continue, then that could help Trump over the line. But as things stand, if things roughly stay as they are, I think she would be my favourite to win in November.
And it's hard to see who the Trump-Vance ticket is reaching out to or appealing to beyond an increasingly marginalised, you know, hardcore base of MAGA supporters. I mean, almost every time, you know, for example, JD Vance opens his mouth, he attacks a different demographic of voters. You know, talking about childless cat ladies. I mean, there's a very powerful childless cat lady, Taylor Swift, who's probably about to come out and back the Harris Waltz ticket and many more. You know, Vance questioning, you know, women who don't have kids. I mean, I think, you know, on the other hand, you've got Waltz, who proudly talks about him and his wife going through IVF, and that being a very, you know, emotive, relatable human experience in a way that I just think Trump and Waltz really struggle. Trump and Vance really struggle to convey. It's a very humanised ticket, I think. The Harris Waltz campaign now, and it is one which I think does look far more normal, far more American, far broader than Trump's increasingly extremist campaign.
Yeah, and something that appeals to people in their own self-image, because the president is the head of state of America, our equivalent to King Charles, who hasn't really been on the stage at all this year, as have none of the royal family really. But for them, it's their big symbolic figurehead, and you have Trump and Vance talking about increasingly sort of bizarre things about childless cat ladies, and you have Kamala Harris and Tim Walz saying that's just bizarre. These people are weird. They're not deplorables. They're not, and people who believe in them aren't beyond the pale. It's just all a bit weird. I mean, it really seems to be an effective attack in a way to just make people themselves think about what they really think about these people. And I often think American politics it is ahead of the curve in a way. I mean, to an extent it always has been, because we're putting together the next print edition at the moment, the September print newspaper, and we'll be featuring a feature article on this weird strategy. And as I was editing it today, I was thinking, like, where is that political thinking here in the UK? What would be the equivalent as to how to deal with Farage and reform? And it's just interesting. It seems to be lacking to me.
More interesting, I think there is some suggestion that the Starmer's win may be having some influence on the Democrat. I mean, when he went over, there was apparently a lot of attention towards him. There's a lot of interest in meeting with him, and a lot of interest in how he succeeded and how the Labour Party succeeded. And it was interesting watching the first campaign event with Waltz and Harris. There was a section in Waltz's speech where he talked about them being a government of service, which is exactly the same language that has been repeatedly used. So I wonder whether that has been borrowed, sort of lifted directly.
So interesting, isn't it?
But again, that really makes that contrast between the kind of weirdness of Trump and their concerns of getting involved in people's sort of reproductive health and all the rest of it, and actually serving the people is all talking about people's benefits and how the government can actually help people, rather than Trump, where it's just all about himself. Because all you hear from Trump is about himself and about how everyone's trying to cheat him. I was watching one of his recent rallies. Most of it was about how annoyed he was that they hadn't let enough people into the stadium, and it was a conspiracy against him that there were some empty seats at the top, which you could barely see anyway.
That's what he was talking about.
Yeah, it's all about himself.
Another part was he was basically suggesting that Google should be shut down by Congress because the Google CEO hadn't called him after the assassination attempt against Trump. It's a very me campaign, isn't it?
There's also been some suggestion that Project 2025, which has been spearheaded by this, again, questionable think tank, the Heritage Foundation, that also seems to now be floundering somewhat. I mean, this is the 900-page document that has been produced for a second Trump presidency, which would fundamentally seek to alter the government and executive of the US, and include things like sacking hundreds and hundreds of civil servants, again, limiting abortion rights further, sweeping tax cuts, and expanding the role of the president. And there has been a fair deal of publicity about this and how much that has been connected to Trump's campaign, which he, of course, has denied. And then there's another clip showing him standing with the people who are authors of it. But there's some suggestion that they've clocked on that that's not favourable. With the public.
Trump is sort of rapidly trying to distance his campaign from that document, which has actually angered a lot of people around him who were involved in drawing that up, because he was, of course, sort of central to all of that and was privately saying he was really behind it, and now suddenly he's distancing. But again, I think this shows what a kind of defensive campaign he's being forced into now because of the effective attacks that the Democrats are launching against him.
I think there's a really interesting contrast in the policy platforms as well, which is emerging. Actually, the policy platform that is emerging for Harris and Walz is actually going to be very progressive. I mean, they're talking about a big expansion in voter rights. Obviously, Harris has been a big campaigner on abortion rights. Defending that is going to mobilise a large part of the Democratic base. And actually, just in terms of what Tim Walz has done in Minnesota in just a couple of years as governor, he's rolled out free school meals to children in the state. Big push on voter rights, rolling back some of the Republican efforts to, what are effectively gerrymandering, tilting the balance in favour of Republicans. So he's introduced things like automatic voter registration, which we're talking about now in the UK. Big pushes on the green agenda, investing in I think he's put a 2040 target on moving to 100% renewables on the energy grid. So it's a progressive, it's a genuinely, you'd call it liberal in the US ticket. But in particular, Walz presents those ideas in a way which is very moderate and considered and isn't, sort of rife with dogmatic keywords. So I think that's been quite clever.
Yeah, and the way he presents it, I think, is he doesn't sort of go into the sort of academic language. Like his argument on abortion rights during the speech was, our view in Minnesota is you should mind your own business. And I think, that's just a really effective way of putting it, rather than sort of talking about, reproductive health and all the rest of it.
And this notion of freedom, which the Harris campaign have put at the centre of their messaging, we're not going back. And that contrast to these two men, Vance and Trump, they want to turn the clock back to very weird times and have very... They almost the opposite of freedom. They want to have more of a role in sort of your personal autonomy, which I think has been quite. There's a real contrast there as well, isn't there?
And I think that was a persuasive part of the case that Labour made at elections is to bring an end to the chaos.
Yes, yeah.
And it's kind of like a mirror image of that in the sense that they're saying, don't return to the chaos of the Trump era.
You've got Harris, a prosecutor as well. And obviously, Keir Starmer, former director of public prosecutions. There's a lot of echoes.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see how that... If Harris does win, I think it'll probably be a very close relationship between Harris administration and a Starmer administration. Despite everything we're seeing at the moment, it could be a very different era to what people might have expected previously.
And just as we finish up, has anyone been watching the Olympics? Anyone had it on in the background?
Not enough.
It used to be a big thing. It's not as big anymore. Maybe I don't know.
I think most normal people are watching it.
I haven't had my zeitgeist tape.
No, we don't. We don't have any. We don't have any bandwidth.
I like skateboarding.
Yeah.
I should probably watch some more.
No, I just remember as like growing up, it always used to be on at home, and it just seemed like a bigger thing. But maybe Adam, you're right. It is a bigger thing for people who are not as.
No, I mean I've watched a lot in the past. I think, and 2012 I actually went to see a few events, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah,
You've been watching the Riot live streams instead.
No, exactly. Unfortunately, that's been the case. Well, thank you to Adam Bienkov and Josiah Mortimer for joining me, Hardeep Matharu, on this episode of Byline Times Live. We'll be back again. We want to keep doing these as regularly as we can, and we really want to get you involved as well. So we are going to start looking into how we can do a 15-minute Q&A session with your questions, which can come through YouTube, because we would like to sort of talk to you directly as well. We always like to hear what our supporters, our readers, and general members of the public think about these issues. So we're not in a bubble, as you know. We're outside of the established press. We're funded by our readers. And without fear and favour, we report on what the papers don't say. So thanks very much for joining us. Have a great weekend. And we'll be back here very soon.